So we're going to have two speakers today, Dr. Jessica Hernandez and Karen Linnell. And we're going to start with Dr. Hernandez. She's a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. I know her from her award-winning Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. And she's currently working on her second book, Growing Papaya Trees. She has also been named by Forbes as the 100 most powerful and influential women of Central America. So it's our pleasure to have Dr. Hernandez here, and I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, yeah, so Wendell Paducci, as mentioned, I'm Dr. Jessica Hernandez. You can call me Jessica, and today I will be giving a quick presentation on how we can prevent pandemics and halt climate change. And in a way we can do that is to strengthen land rights for Indigenous peoples. So today I'm virtually presenting from the Coachella Shared Waters and Lands, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Seattle. So my first question, and you can type it in the chat, is, and I think it's important for me to ask this question, right, especially when presenting as an Indigenous person, can one Indigenous person speak for all Indigenous people? So if you think yes, type it in the chat yes, no, or not sure. And I will give you a couple seconds to write down your responses. So can one Indigenous person speak for all Indigenous peoples? And obviously the answer is no, right? And I think that's important to highlight that even though we are often referred to as a monolithic group, right, we're very different as our indigeneity, our identity is very place-based. So based on our environments, we are all different in that intersectionalities. A little bit more about me. So I'm from the Zapotec Nation in Oaxaca, Mexico. We are one of the only remaining matriarchal societies among indigenous communities, which is very unfortunate. So in our systems, our women in our third gender, known as the muches, have the authority and also the leadership to own land, to also, serve in political roles, and basically our entire pueblos is kind of led by women. So I think that is very distinct in the way that I was raised, given that, outside of my pueblo, there's a lot of patriarchy, right? Where women are supposed to be submissive, where women shouldn't have that leadership, where there is like oppression that women face based on solely gender. So one of the things that it's important for me to highlight, especially when talking about land rights and kind of highlighting the work that I do with land rights, is that I come from one of the land back movements that happened in Central America. So during the 1950s all the way to 1990s, Central America, which consists of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, basically experienced a war. And this is known as the Central American Civil War or the Central American Armed Conflict. And during that time, what was going on is that our governments were selling our lands through land grabs to these large international corporations. So if you enjoy coffee, if you enjoy bananas, if you enjoy pineapples, these are all crops that come from these plantations that basically were introduced into our lands as a result of these land grabs and these plantations being implemented. So one of the things that our indigenous peoples did was that they started building resistance movement to reclaim our land. So during that process, the government ended up finding out that we were trying to reclaim our land. So one of the things that they used was the C word, right, which is communism, to get a lot of money and also military training from the United States and Canada. So as a result, this led to the war. And one of the first things that they did was to target our men. So as a result, because the adult population basically, diminished, one of the next things that they do, especially, and it happens all around with indigenous communities, right, is that they target our children. So as a result, many of our children were forced to fight as child soldiers, whether they were forced to fight in the army, but if they were able to escape, they could join the group, which is known as the FMNLN, which is the guerrilla, which is basically consistent of indigenous peoples and peasants who were trying to reclaim the land. And my father was 14 when he joined the guerrilla and participated in this land back movement. So as a result, in order for many children who were able to survive, they had to escape, right? And that what's led to the displacement. And nowadays, according to the United Nations, this is known as a genocide because it targeted indigenous peoples. So oftentimes when I talk about genocide, for me it's something that's ingrained in my lived experiences, given that it dates back to my grandparents and my parents' generation. So it's not that long ago for me when I speak about genocide. So this kind of gave me a interesting lens, especially being given the privilege to attend higher education, where I have integrated my lived experiences to the sciences and all the environmental advocacy that I do today, especially around land rights. So as we know, right, we're kind of facing two kind of catastrophe events. One of them we know is the pandemic, and the other one is climate change. So oftentimes when we talk about the pandemic and climate change, we kind of do not necessarily intersect or interconnect both of them, right? Because we are often conditioned to think in binary lenses, where we are conditioned to think in option A or option B, but not holistically as indigenous peoples do. So the pandemic and climate change are very related, given that if there's ecosystem changes and biodiversity loss, these are drivers to pandemic virus emergence and also the exacerbation of climate change impacts. And I'm going to be explaining a little bit more about that. So when we talk about pandemic and also the climate change, there are a lot of structural forces that are often ignored within these discourses. So I want to give you a couple of seconds to name some of those structural forces that are often ignored within climate change and pandemics. So you can use the chat to kind of provide some of your responses, or also give some verbal responses, since it's hard to see the chat. So if you want to participate, make sure you can unmute yourself as well, if that's even an option. Okay. So some of those structural forces, right, are patriarchy, globalization, this concept of individual ownership, especially as it comes to our lands, settler colonialism, and capitalism. So oftentimes, as a result of these structural forces, right, the relationship that we have with our lands differs. So I'm going to skip that I was going to ask you for your responses. But when we talk about the relationship we have with our land, right, oftentimes the land is given a feminine kind of characteristic, hence Mother Nature, Mother Earth. And as a result, right, one of the things that in my matriarchs, especially from my matriarchal society, often told me was that it mimics the relationship and the behavior that we also impose on women, right? Especially given that patriarchy is a dominant lens. So as a result, that relationship is also paralleled in the relationship we have with our Mother Earth and Mother Nature, in the ways that we are taught that we own the land, right? We can also exploit the land, and the land should provide for us, right? And you can see how this parallels a lot of the gender norms that are often embedded in patriarchy. So when we talk about indigenous peoples, I think that's important to highlight, right? The land is and means different things to indigenous peoples. For indigenous peoples, pastoral communities and rural farming communities, they're dependent on the land because it's a way of sustenance, it's a way of life, and it shapes their identity. And as a result, right, of this relationship that indigenous peoples and also pastoral communities have with their land, they're more uniquely vulnerable, right? Because I think that everybody's vulnerable, but when it comes to indigenous peoples, we're uniquely vulnerable in the sense that when the land is destroyed, it doesn't necessarily just destroy the natural resources that we're taught to think of. It also kind of in a way impacts our identity and shapes our cultural ways of being. So as a result, right, it's important for us to highlight how the land means different things to indigenous peoples, and how that relationship kind of creates a unique manifestation when the land is desecrated. As we know, and I'm going to kind of individualize this to my own experiences, there's a spiritual connection that we have with our land, right? Where we're taught as Zapotec people that the land is our first mother, and as a result, we have to protect it. We are also taught that we are part of nature, and as a result of that, that can be manifested from our creation stories, right? Where we are told that our gods and goddesses and deities created us from the native and plants and animals, and also the abiotic factors such as rocks, water, that are located in our environments to create us as a community. A lot of our traditional regalia resembles our natural environments, whether we used some of our native plants or animals to create our traditional regalia, or also kind of in a way embroider a lot of the native plants and flowers. Especially in my community, our regalia is composed of our native flowers in that embroidery. And as a result of that, right, everything can be place-based to the indigenous communities that we're talking about. So when we talk about indigenous stewardship, I'm going to be highlighting two things, and this kind of derives from the work that I do within back in my communities and also in Africa. So I wanted to ask you all, because I think that it shows the importance of indigenous stewardship. Do you know what percentage of the world's biodiversity is currently stored by indigenous peoples? So, write down in a paper, or tell your partner what percentage do you think this is, the response to this. And I'll give you a couple seconds, and then I'm going to present the response. So as we know, that's 80%, right? So indigenous peoples are currently stewarding 80% of the world's biodiversity. So one of the things that's important to highlight, especially when it comes to pandemics and also biodiversity loss, is that within this biodiversity, there are also hotspots. And what are referred to as hotspots? So hotspots are locations that are also home to human and communities, right? Where many are situated at borderlands of national parks or within native ecosystems. So as a result of that, right, this is one of the reasons that kind of highlights why there's biodiversity, especially where indigenous peoples currently steward their lands. However, the relationship between hotspots and viruses is that scientists have long known that these hotspots were population of bats and non-human primates and other wildlife cluster are also home to most unknown viruses and most important terrestrial carbon reserves on the planet. So we look at the pandemic, especially the current pandemic of COVID-19, we know that it kind of originated from a hotspot, right? Because we know that given that there's a lot of biodiversity, Western science hasn't necessarily caught up to know all the wildlife viruses or potential viruses that can come from animal to humans in those conditions, right? And as a result, we're seeing how climate change is destroying a lot of those hotspots, and it's also reducing in biodiversity loss. So we're seeing this connection between wildlife and humans at a different lens, right? And if you look at the history of COVID-19, you will see how that kind of resulted as a disease emergence because there's biodiversity loss that's happening where the COVID-19 kind of originated. So going back to land disruptions, right? When there's land disruption in these biodiversity hotspots, there's a major driver of virus spillover and contribute to climate change, right? So we're seeing how these two things are going hand in hand. So if there's biodiversity loss because there's land disruptions, we have more virus spillover, which in a way also amplifies the climate change impacts that we're facing. When there's also land disruption at these biodiversity hotspots, we also know that the connections between novel virus dynamics, climate, and the changing context of life for millions of indigenous peoples living in these hotspots are mostly overlooked, simplified, ignored by pandemic disease research and prevention programs. So as we can see, especially hopefully you have learned from other speakers, right? We saw how the pandemic kind of, in a way, impacted indigenous communities the most, right? And that was only contextualized within the United States. Now we contextualize it to indigenous peoples from a global context, back in Latin America, back in Africa. It kind of impacted indigenous peoples at a much higher rate than all nations in general. So I think that this kind of shows how land disruptions kind of impact pandemic emergence, especially pandemics that come from that zoonotic disease, which is coming from an animal to human, and also, increases climate change impacts as we talk about indigenous peoples. So one of the things that I'm going to also highlight is two stewardships, and this kind of highlights the work that I do back home in Oaxaca and also the work that I do in Africa, in particular Kenya. So the first stewardship that we actually have that we can trace back to ancestral times is a milpa. And a milpa is in a way a sustainable agricultural system that's able to sustain itself without much human labor, right? It only needs our human labor when we're harvesting or also when we're doing and practicing our ceremonies, because there are deities and gods that are connected to the milpa. And this milpa has been one of the things that hasn't been in a way erased or eradicated because of colonialism, because as you have learned in this seminar, right, colonialism has impacted our ways of being as indigenous peoples, in particular that traditional ecological knowledge that comes from our ancestors. So as you can see here in the milpa, women, men, our elders, our children all have a role in protecting this milpa. And one of the things that it kind of shows a unique land ownership lens is that the milpa is not owned by one person. The milpa is not owned by one family. The milpa is owned by the entire community. So when you're taking food and crops from the milpa, you're sharing it around the entire pueblo. And I think that this is one of the unique ways that indigenous people steward our lands and kind of highlight that communal land ownership when it comes to land rights. So as you can see here, there's a lot of steps that happen in the milpas. So one of the beautiful things about the milpa is that it's able to regrow after 4 stages. So in the final stage, the milpa burns itself, right? And I think that oftentimes we see how it parallels a little bit of prescribed burning, but one of the beauties about the milpa is that it burns itself so that it can regenerate the soil and kind of prepare itself for the next cycle. So I think that that shows the beauty and also the strength of that traditional ecological knowledge, or as I like to refer to it, as indigenous science that comes from our ancestors, and it's something that we're still able to practice today. And this kind of gives you the 4 stages of the milpas. You can see here that's the milpa burning. Obviously, there is some prescribing that we do so that we, given that climate change is impacting our environments, right, so that it doesn't create a wildfire. So it's an interesting phenomenon, right, that even scientists today are not able to understand. So now the second land stewardship that I'm going to highlight is pastoralism. And pastoralism is kind of different than we're used to seeing in America. So in here, some indigenous communities also inhabit the rangelands that cover 54% of the world's land surface, which is usually land that's unsuitable for agriculture and infrastructure and development. So when we look at indigenous communities, we're kind of inhabiting 50% of what we consider marginal lands, right? Where nothing will grow, where nothing can be built on, because these lands are not sustainable in that sense. So one of the things that indigenous peoples, especially in the continent of Africa, have been able to do is this stewardship that they have done since ancient times as well, where they practice livestock depending livelihood strategies known as pastoralism. So one of the things of pastoralism is that indigenous peoples, especially, it's important because it's usually led by indigenous women, right? And we're talking going back to how patriarchy has manifested the way that we view our lands and also the land rights that women are given. Through this pastoralism, right, they kind of herd their cattle and everything that else that they have, which is goats, usually native animals to those lands. And as a result, one of the things that they see is that when there's lands, even though they're marginal lands, are being conducted through pastoralism, the carbon cycle is balanced or even negative when we're talking about those lands that are marginal but are kind of stewarded by pastoral communities. We also see how migratory herds sustain healthy soils. So one of the things that often happens, especially in Kenya, where I do my work, is that they're kind of given communal rights to the land, but not necessarily communal, like that deed to the land that allows them to own it. Oftentimes they're given temporary communal ownership, where most of the time, the government allows the indigenous peoples of Kenya to do pastoralism in marginal lands, and once they become healthy, they kind of displace the people and no longer allow them to be in those lands, right? And I think that one of the works that we're doing, especially at the international level, is trying to strengthen land rights as it comes to pastoral communities, right? Because it's not fair for them to steward these lands, and then once they're no longer marginal, for the government to kind of remove them and displace them because they want to sell and obviously make more money. So I think that that's one of the works that also is important to highlight, especially given all the indigenous solidarity that I also do within um, the south, the global south, in particular, Latin America and Africa. So when we talk about lands and health, I was going to ask you what are some of the intersections that you see, but I'm going to give you the responses. So one of the intersections that we see between land rights and health is that marginalization, exclusion, and forced displacement of indigenous peoples, which has been shaped by colonial and post-colonial politics and economies, right? So oftentimes, even when we have that communal ownership, whether it be temporarily or long term, we're seeing how illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal deforestation, or just simply displacing indigenous peoples is leading us to displacement beyond settler borders. And oftentimes we're displaced from the global south to the global north, which is in my case something that happened in my household and in my family, right? Which is why I'm displaced now within the global north. At the margins of state control and experience, state incursion through systems of taxation, isolation, monetization, commodification, and deculturation, right? So all of these systems are kind of manifested to kind of allow governments to displace indigenous peoples. And I think that one of the important things to highlight is that deculturization, right? Talking about the relationship that as indigenous peoples we have with the lands. If they're displacing us from our lands, they're, in a way deculturally us from that identity that we have. And it's important to highlight that this doesn't mean passivity, right? Because oftentimes we can, in a way, promote that saviorism complex because indigenous peoples, there's indigenous resistance movements and land defenders across the world that are fighting every day to reclaim their lands and halt extractive activities, right? And working at this intersection is always important for me to highlight because, as an indigenous person, I often witness how there's that saviorism that happens, especially presented by non-indigenous peoples. So when we talk about indigenous land back, these are two important kind of data sets that I like to amplify. So in Brazil, the legal recognition of indigenous forests in 2000 reduced deforestation by more than 20-fold by 2005, right? So we saw how even the legal recognition of indigenous forests and being given that in a way that land back, but to indigenous peoples allows for us to reduce deforestation by 20-fold, which is a huge number, right? Unfortunately, after 2005, we saw that new president. So he kind of pushed us back because he allowed for a lot of illegal deforestation to occur. Now, when we talk about North America, and this is also including Mexico, indigenous resistance in North America has stopped or delayed greenhouse gases pollution equal to a quarter of annual emissions from the US and Canada combined. So we're seeing how, including Canada, the US, and also Mexico, how we have delayed greenhouse gases due to indigenous resistance. And this includes resistance against oil pipelines, resistance against removing extractive mining companies from our lands, and so forth. So one of the ways that we can, in a way, reshape the way that we think about land rights and also pandemics when it comes to climate change is to push back against the dominant lens, which is of the scientific method, right? So we can see how the Western sciences tends to be very linear and binary, where we are often treated as areas of expertise or research subjects by non-indigenous peoples, right? And one of the things that it also fails to recognize is indigenous science and knowledge systems as essential, right? So I was showing you how stewardship and also halting pandemics and virus spillover can happen if indigenous peoples are given the right to steward their lands. And for the moment of time, I think that I'm going to stop soon. So I think that one of the things that we can do is go beyond acknowledgments, right, and understand what we have to do to, in a way, center indigenous ways of knowing. So I have highlighted 7 steps, and obviously there's more, or these steps can be adapted based on the indigenous community you're working with. But the first step is to follow and create a fluid and dynamic approaches that do not follow the linear research method, which is the scientific method. Number two is to respect tribal sovereignty and indigenous autonomy. In the global south, we do not have tribal sovereignty, so I think that's important for us if we're doing work, especially if we're not from the global south, to respect that indigenous autonomy there. Number three is to follow indigenous protocols and their way of being and doing things in their community. Number four is to respect intellectual property, right? Because oftentimes in academia, we're taught that we have to extract and work with indigenous communities. It has to result in a byproduct that will that will basically support our success, whether it be a publication. And oftentimes, that's not going to be the case. Number five is to embrace all indigenous epistemologies relevant to the community, so all ways of knowing. Number six is to kind of create an indigenous-led project, and that will sometimes call for us to step back and allow indigenous communities to, have full control of the project. And number seven is to understand that indigenous science cannot be extracted, therefore you need indigenous peoples, right? And oftentimes when I work at the intersection of land rights and viruses, right, a lot of people think that they can just extract indigenous knowledges, that we can just integrate indigenous knowledges into something, but that's not the case, right? Because in order for us to do that, we have to include those indigenous peoples, because indigenous sciences or knowledges is not something that can be extracted like Western sciences. And that is all for the remainder of the time. And thank you for allowing me to present.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Do you have time for a few questions?
Thank you for sharing your story and your research. I was wondering if you had thought about sort of protected areas across the globe. And we know a lot of people want to do like the 30% of land and 30% of waters, be protected from habitat loss. And just curious, where you sit on thinking, what the role of Indigenous people should be in protected areas. I think some people think they should maybe belong to Indigenous people. Some people don't want any people in there at all.
Yeah, for me, I think contextualizing to the experiences I have, especially working in Kenya and Latin America, is that it's important if we're gonna try to have a protected area to give that communal ownership to indigenous peoples, because like as we're seeing in Brazil, right, indigenous peoples were allowed to control and manage their forest, and that kind of in a way reduce deforestation by almost 20%, right? However, when a new administration comes in, they may have a different agenda, right? And because those indigenous communities in the Amazon were not given that communal ownership, the new administration with Vocero came in and kind of let, like threw all the work that they had done out of the window, right? Because deforestation increased by over 50% during his administration. And we're seeing how that deforestation has, in a way, created present day genocides, right? If you are keeping up with the news, you're seeing how that deforestation is leading to the genocide of many Amazonian tribes. So I think that for me, especially when it comes to stewarding lands or having protected areas, is to have like some written records that indigenous peoples have that communal ownership. And that's different than individual ownership, right? Because if we were a community right now and everybody has like land lots, and a lot of indigenous communities are not for individual ownerships, right? Because sometimes we can sell them, or sometimes we move and we sell those plots. Communal ownership doesn't allow individuals to sell the land because it belongs to the entire community. So it's impossible to sell the land, right? Because it's in a way it's something that the seven generations get to steward. So that's the mentality between communal and individual ownership. And I think that it's important to give that communal ownership to indigenous peoples in protected areas, given that if there's a new administration that is pro deforestation or pro oil, they can quickly change that and just displace indigenous peoples moving forward. But thank you for your question.
Chat. Great talk. Can you share some insight about how we can contribute to the land back movement at the individual level?
I think for me, and I think it's interesting, right? Because I work with land rights at the international level. Oftentimes, people do not necessarily comprehend what the land back movement means. And I think that it's important to bring different indigenous perspectives, right? Because some indigenous communities think that there's violence that needs to be enacted for us to achieve the land back movement. Other communities think that we can work together with, non-Indigenous peoples to get the land back movement. But for me, the land back movement, the definition that I use is that it allows Indigenous peoples to co-manage their landscapes. And I think that at the individual level, it's just understanding what the local Indigenous communities of the lands you're occupying, what land back entails for them, and seeing how you can support those efforts. So I think it's, going to a local community, learning what land back means to them, and also seeing how you can support them at the individual level before you try to support the movement at a larger scale, whether it be national all the way to global. Thank you for that question.
Well, thank you so much for your talk and for your answers, and we just are very privileged to have you here with us today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Paducci.
Okay, so at this time, we're going to introduce our next speaker, since we have two today. This is Karen Linnell, the Executive Director for the Ahtna Intertribal Resource Commission. And then because of our time, I'm going to just let her take over with that very short introduction.
Hi there. Good morning here. Good afternoon. I'm Karen Linnell. I am the daughter of Lemmy and Edna Charlie. I am Wazinedi on my Tlingit side, which is the Eagle and Brown Bear clan, and I am Nalchina on my Ahtna side. And I'm calling you from the heart of the Copper River Basin in Alaska on Ahtna, from the Ahtna territory. Let me see if I can share my slide. So the Ahtna Intertribal Resource Commission is made up of 8 tribes where we get our authority from. We don't do anything without their permission. They're the ones with the sovereign rights. And 2 ENCSA corporations who are landowners, Ahtna Incorporated and Chittenden Native Corporation. And so our org chart kind of looks like this because we are truly, we're one people, but these 8 tribes and give us the authority. There's dialogue that goes back and forth. We share with them, they share with us. And so that makes up who Ahtna Intertribal Resource Commission is. Our purpose and mission is Ahtna is honoring and integrating traditional knowledge and values through stewardship that is innovative and respectful of the land for all generations. This is the Ahtna territory is the red outline. The red checkerboard that you see is Ahtna and Chittenden Native Corporation lands. The blue, the light blue and dark blue is state land or state selected. The purple in the upper right-hand corner is the Tetlan Wildlife Refuge. The pink on either side are the Denali and Wrangell St. Elias National Parks. So we have 2 of the largest national parks in the country within our territory. Some of the stakeholders that have an impact on Ahtna lands, where elders say God put us on this land to be stewards of this land, and so that he's number 1 on our list. But you can see there's quite a bit of organizations and special interest groups that get involved in what happens on our land, and so it's good to be aware of them and know who can impact what's happening on our lands. There's an interdependency of the Ahtna people to our land. Not only is it provide for our subsistence way of life, but it ties in our culture, our spirituality, our physical health and mental health comes from being connected to that land. And this came out of our search conference that we held in 2013. That interconnectivity, that piece that's there is so important to who we are. We look at, you know, we have folks that move away and are wondering why we're, you know, they're feeling so disconnected and things, and it's because they haven't been home in a while. And so when they do get to come home and walk the land, you don't even have to visit with people. Really, for me, that's how it was. I just had to drive back through and see my mountains and know I was home. We compete for our resources. This is opening day for hunting season in one parking lot. There's 165 vehicles in this, and I blew it up and counted it with 2- and 4-place trailers, hauling ATVs out to look for moose and caribou. So competition is a big driver and why we're involved in trying to get more, create more habitat and get more animals on the land, so we're not fighting over that last moose. We work on tribal stewardship. The picture on the far left is one of our elders who's now gone, working on land selections. And a lot of our land selections were to protect the river. The center picture is the same village, Coutina, and those yellow stickies are family names and where people came from. And I got to tell you, this was the most powerful moment I've ever experienced in this. And when you say the Ahtna people were walking the land, when they put family names, and the elder in the middle there, Faye Ewan, was saying, your grandpa came from right here. She was telling the young people, and your great grandpa on your mom's side was over on this side. Totally changed the conversation in what was happening there in our mapping exercise. And then the far right, we're working with young people and asking them if they know where to go, where they would go berry picking, and or where they go fishing, and where they look for caribou or moose. And these kids were 6 to 12 years old. A lot more of the younger kids, and they knew quite a bit, which gives us hope. And I participated in a caribou working group where we were talking about sharing all the data. This included the National Park Service, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Tetlin Wildlife Refuge, the Wrangell St. Elias Subsistence Resource Commission, and Ahtna Intertribal Resource Commission. And they were talking about the lack of information. We were talking about predators and things like that. And one of the folks there at the meeting said, well, we're not stopping people from subsistence trapping. And I told them, well, no, but the river is. And from that conversation, we got a contract with the National Park Service to collect TEK from both tribal and non-tribal residents of the Cup River Basin to see the use of the caribou and the changing in winter travel and access. And this is a picture taken in January last year, and the river is still not frozen. So you can see that it's not safe to cross into the river to be able to go trapping. Again, another project that started from one of our elders. He said, why are you issuing permits? You don't even know how many bears are on the land. And he was talking about allowing non-tribal folks to get on Ahtna land to hunt bears. And so we created a partnership with ADFG, Ahtna Incorporated, and UAF to do a non-invasive hair snare across Game Management Unit 13 to estimate the bear density and distribution. And again, from our elders project, and it started in 2018 with a single site. And the department said, you'll be lucky to see one bear this time of year, this location. And it takes a year to get the analysis back. So 2019, late 2019, we'd already done another site. We got the analysis back and found out there were 30 bears there. And so it built that partnership. ADFG said, oh, well, we need to look into this. So they started their own sites and we had ours. And then we were able to build and work together on a methodology for that data collection and what they're doing. They're taking the best information or the best practices from Glacier National Park and out of British Columbia, because it has similar terrain, and adapt it to fit our terrain and our area. So we had these sites. We're actually invited into Denali National Park and in the edge of the Wrangell St. Elias National Park to look at the flow of those animals in and out of the park as well. And again, it's a partnership. We expect to get 5 peer-reviewed publications out of this. We have a data sharing agreement, and so that was pretty significant. Before it would be our information and their information and nothing across the entire thing. So it was really cool. This last year we had 5 crews out checking all of those sites. ADFG had 2, we had 3. And then we share the cost on the DNA analysis as well as sharing the data. So that was a pretty significant change in the dynamics and relationship we have with the Department of Fish and Game. Another question our elders had was, are moose safe to eat? We have a lot of people that are getting cancer, or, you know, it's got to be something in our food. And so our ecologist started looking at what can we do to answer this. And so we're doing a moose health monitoring project. We started in the fall. Kelsey had been on staff for 2 weeks when she heard this question. And so over the summer, she was thinking about it. And then it was hunting season. She's like, okay, this is what we can do. So we're collecting the kidney, a sample from the kidney, a sample from the liver, because we do eat all of those parts, some muscle, and then the front teeth of the moose so we can age them. So that we can see if there are heavy metals in the moose, and that could be affecting our health. And we just dropped those off at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. They have a new mass spectrometer. So we're their first client, and we actually got additional funding to continue this project for 2 more years. And then we're looking at additional projects, monitoring the Mantastic caribou herd, predator-prey dynamics, and we have bison, and we want to look at their range and kind of get an assessment there as well. We had an elder ask us about what would it take to restore salmon to Town Lake. When I was a kid, there was salmon there, and there haven't been any for decades. And so we did an environmental assessment. We're looking at eDNA. We set some minnow traps. We're looking at water quality, and then putting into our plan the steps to move forward to that restoration. If you look at the picture there, that lake is in the middle of Ahtna, which was a pretty booming mining hub. The mining wasn't here, it was quite a ways away, but this town was pretty busy. And there, the trail or that you see go around the lake is where the train used to go around the lake to turn around and go back down towards Cordova. Coutina River Sonar, again, Ahtna, there's been a change in the right-of-way and access trail there for Coutina or the Brentwood Craig Road. And so we started analysis in Coutina River Sonar last year, looking at escapement into the Coutina River. 33 to 54% of the sockeye return go into the Coutina system. And so this is an important part, and we'd like to keep track of it and have a baseline there. You're looking at the passing on of knowledge. Here, a young man at our migratory bird camp is teaching the youth and our adults at the camp on how to clean the gizzards out of some ducks that we got. Passing on that knowledge and being able to share it and use it, you know, is so much a part of who we are, having them learn the skills so that they can survive. And for me, this was a very proud moment. Instead of the elders teaching the youth, we had this young man teaching us what he learned when he'd gone home to his dad's country. Indigenous Sentinels Network, we're working on tribal stewardship mapping that you saw earlier, but getting it into a GIS system. And then we're developing an app to involve our tribal citizens in data collection. And so in the blue, the little brown circle there, that's the ISN Citizens app. And then they will be able to input information in there, incorporating new technology in our data collection. We get a lot of things about, oh, it's purely anecdotal when we go to testify at the Board of Game or the Board of Fish on what we're seeing happening on the land. Well, now we're going to back it up with data. It's sad that we have to quantify things in this way, but it's necessary. As a former Board of Game member, I was at a board meeting and one of our elders went to talk about his 80 years of walking the land and the changes that he's seen. And they just said, "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Any questions?" "No." "Okay," and let him go. And then a guide came on board and he talked and he said, "Well, I've been here since 1978 and 70 or 74." And he said, and one of our Board of Game members said, "I don't know anybody who spent 40 years walking this land." I about fell over. And so for traditional folks to be able to, and tribal members to be able to speak to their long-term knowledge and long-term observations, we have to hire biologists, anthropologists, and ecologists to help us quantify what we're seeing on the land in a way that Western science will listen. And so we're hoping to do that with this Indigenous Sentinels Network. We do a lot of advocacy. This is a transboundary group. The gentleman on the far left is Joe Copperjack, whose grandfather came from Ahtna country. And we talked about those family ties. So the Canadian border is an arbitrary line between our peoples. And we've been talking about that when we look at resource management, that these arbitrary lines that could get put on our land, change management, ownership from federal to state, and we're trying to remove those lines so that they can plan across the landscape. And that's kind of what we do. And if I go back to our map, you can see the complex land system, that ownership system that we have. And Ahtna Intertribal Resource Commission, or ATRIC, we look at, you know, what can we do to be that voice for the fish and the wildlife? How can we, you know, do what's best for that resource in a way that we can help them? It's always our belief that if we take care of it, it will take care of us. And that's what our mission is, to take care of the land, to take care of the fish and the wildlife, so that it will be here to take care of us. And it can't just be on the tribal people to take care of it. We've got to educate our neighbors and folks across the state and who visit this area to take care of it as well. So that's kind of all I had. You know, we're looking at, you know, we're trying to answer questions put to us by our elders with science, and then taking and trying to quantify our traditional knowledge in a way that Western managers can understand.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. It's great to hear about Indigenous-led research, especially that are contributing to helping tribal nations, and I really appreciate you joining us today. Looks like we have a question online.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experiences. With the results of larger bear numbers than the outside organizations expected, has there been any change in permits? And have there been changes in actions due to the collected data?
Oh, thank you for that. So last year, our region, our area, we come up on a 3-year cycle in regards to regulations with the Board of Game. It came up and we asked them not to change anything until we get the results from this year, 2022. Once we have that information, I'm sure we'll have some reports drafted with the numbers for the entire region, because the first number was just in such a small area. So we've got 2 years of data, and this year, or in 2022, it was done in a head-to-head comparison with the way they've always done it, which is aerial flights and looking for some of the collared bears that they have. And speaking with the pilots, our wildlife biologist was told that after the first day or two, the bears hide. They know what's going on. And so, and it's, they fly like 1/20th of the area. And so whatever they count there, they multiply by 20, which isn't very scientific in my eyes. But with this method, I hope to, and we're gonna also compare costs so that we can look and see if this is even more cost efficient and things like that, and be able to, we'll know more. We're hoping our DNA results will be back in June. Usually we don't get them back until September or October, but we got them out like the day after we were done with field season, they were tagged and bagged and sent out. So we're hoping we got ahead in the queue of analysis and be able to get them back sooner. And we'll be drafting a report late this summer and fall for the department in probably by January of 2024.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your talk today. My question: do you think there's any hope for land managers, especially at the government level, to make land management decisions based on things other than Western science? It seems to me, I do see the conflict. You mentioned that you need to quantify your observations in a way that's acceptable to Western science. As a scientist myself, I understand exactly what you mean by that. And I understand why Western science, it is what it is. It's very rigidly defined. And if it doesn't fit those rigid definitions, then it's not scientific. And that's okay. But the problem is the value that we place on those Western metrics as the only way of knowing. And you're talking about other ways of knowing that don't fit nice and neat and tidy in that box of Western science. And I think anyone who has any sort of spiritual inclination whatsoever will be very open to the idea that that reality, that our experiences, that are what it all means. Those are realms that Western science, on purpose, it stays away from it. It has nothing to do with it. And that's all fine, right? And so we talk about as long as we stay in our lanes, we avoid trouble. But we can't stay in our lane when our paths intersect, right? So my question is, I don't know what sort of answer you might even give me, but what do you think? What would be the hope for a land manager, a natural resource steward, to accept to make land management decisions based on things that are not acceptable to Western science?
So our research, like with the bear study, was done. We weren't sure what we were going to find. We were testing equipment. We had one of those hair trigger snap that snapped, and it was a pretty labor intensive thing, and a moose walking by could trigger it versus a bear. And so then you had to go back out there and reset it, and we often get told, well, our proposals aren't scientific enough. We're not sure what you're going to get out of it, and that kind of thing. And a lot of it is, we have to sell it as a feasibility. We're gonna check this out and see what happens, right? And see if there's anything worth getting into. We were talking. I can tell you and give you an example. I attended the Fish and Wildlife Society meeting in Fairbanks a few years back, and the North Slope Borough has quite a extensive natural resource department, and of course we have whaling in out of Barrow or Utqiagvik, and the elders were telling them for years that they weren't counting the whales under the ice. And of course, Western science is, oh, well, they can't stay under there that long. And it wasn't until technology caught up and we could get GPS and tag them and follow them with a GPS that they found out that they have much larger ranges and that there are several hundred under the ice that they weren't counting. But then one of the elders too would, when they're getting ready to go out whaling, and they tell them, the young men, no, you got to go clean up. You got to go, you can't use cologne, you can't use shampoo, you know, the scented shampoos and things like that, because the whales can smell you. You can't burn trash. They'll, you know, don't burn anything. You gotta get clean before we go out there because they can smell you. Well, the elder had been telling the biologist this for years, and he didn't. And finally, the biologist said, well, I wonder, you know, if old Joe, and I'm making up a name here now, if old Joe is right. And he got permission from one of the whaling captains to bisect a whale head, and he found olfactory glands. So, you know, sometimes it takes a lot of talking on our part. And, you know, it's funny that we don't like to repeat ourselves. A lot of our elders, if they tell you once, that's it, and they're done. It's not that it's important, but we expect you to be listening. And so a lot of times when we say something, we're finished. But we found that we have to repeat ourselves. And I met with an elder from the Salish Kootenai, and he told me, you gotta educate, educate, educate. And it seems like we're constantly educating managers on federal side or the state side, and then they rotate out, right? They move up or move over or out of the area, and we're restarting the process. And with these managers, they come and go, we're still here, right? And why they won't listen when we talk, I'm not sure. It's like your short time on this land is not the same as, you know, 80 years of walking the land, right? At my fish camp, I have 2 streams upstream from me. And so I either get a Bensonidi fish or a Seslote fish. And I can tell you which one's which by the size and the color. And when we were talking at the time, I still had an elder alive that was talking about the fish from when he was in China, which is because my fish camp is near the headwaters. His fish camp was farther downriver, about 100 miles. And so he could tell you which one came from Tonsina, which one came from Gokana River, which one came from Coutina. And by the time, by the run timing, by the size, by the color. And so we've been telling this to Wrangell St. Elias National Park, and they're just now doing genetics testing. And I had a young fishing guide at one of our symposiums that was on what is the future of Copper River salmon. And she said, well, the Gokana fish are freakishly big. It has to do because of the hatchery. And our hatchery is an incubation unit. It's not where they change the water temperature and put chemicals in the water to keep it free of disease. It's an incubation unit fed by a cold spring. And I told her, no, it's just big because it comes from the Gokana River system. It's different than the Coutina River system. It's a much larger system. And so it's different for that reason. And so now the resource manager at Wrangell St. Elias is listening and looking at genetics to see if we can tell the difference between those species and where they come from, and hopefully to use it as a management tool for in-season management.
So I guess the answer of your question to me, as I understood it, is you can tell them as much as you want to tell them, but until they actually have a Western science based results, they're still not going to listen, right?
Exactly. I heard it's hopeless. That's what
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much, Karen. I appreciate you spending time with us. This has been great. I'll reach out after this, and we just are lucky to have you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, just real quick, I encourage you to work with the tribes and the people on the land to get to know them, you know, get to know them, ask questions, and listen. A lot of Western science, you have a hypothesis already. You already know where you want to go with your research, and you're limiting things rather than looking at the broad picture, right? And looking at the interactions between species and things is so important. We talk about these things like they're, you know, oh, we're only looking at the wolves. That's it. We don't want to know what's going on. Well, the wolves eat salmon. When there's no salmon, it has a direct impact on the wolves. And then they'll go after the moose and the caribou, right? And so there's this interconnectivity. There's this land ownership working across the land ownership to work at healthy populations and those kinds of things. You can't manage for intensive management on this side and not over here, because they'll just move over and, you know, it'll become a prey pit. So looking at both sides of those things are so important. And so I just really encourage you to not whittle down your research so much that you miss what's happening in the big picture. You know, you have to be a little more holistic in what you're seeing in observations. And so I just really encourage you to do that and get to know the folks that are local there on the ground, because they can help you a lot. We had a fisheries scientist come up, and he was going to go to the spawning grounds to collect samples, but the timing that he was going to go, they would have all been rotted away, and he would have wasted his time had he. And so now he talks to us before he starts to go out on the land. So those kinds of things are important, and I just appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak to you folks. Thank you so much.